The rain fell hard that November night in New York City, turning the streets into rivers of neon and shadow. Mara Lewis gripped the steering wheel of her beaten Honda Civic, eyes strained against the downpour as she searched for an address that didn't seem to exist. The package on her passenger seat had been marked urgent, the kind that meant her already meager paycheck would get docked if she didn't deliver it before midnight. She was 26 years old and drowning in hospital bills. Her mother lay 3 floors up in Mount Sinai, tubes running from her arms, machines beeping a rhythm that sounded like borrowed time. Mara worked 3 delivery routes back to back, sleeping 4 hours a night in her car between shifts, surviving on gas station coffee and the desperate mathematics of someone who couldn't afford to fail. The GPS had died 2 miles back. She was navigating by street signs now, squinting through rain that fell like bullets against her windshield. The neighborhoods had changed without her noticing, the transition from working-class Queens to something else entirely. The buildings here stood taller, darker, wrapped in iron gates and security cameras that watched with unblinking eyes. She found the address finally, almost missing it in the storm. The gate was open, which seemed wrong, but the package had been marked for this exact location. She pulled through, tires crunching on gravel that led to a massive estate hidden behind ancient oak trees. The house loomed ahead, all stone and shadow, the kind of place that shouldn't exist in the middle of New York, but somehow did. Mara killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against metal. Something felt wrong. The air tasted metallic, charged with the kind of electricity that comes before lightning strikes. But she thought of her mother's medication, the specialist consultation scheduled for next week, the stack of bills growing on her kitchen table like a paper mountain she'd never climb. She grabbed the package and ran through the rain to the front entrance, a massive wooden door that belonged in a medieval castle. No doorbell. She knocked, water streaming down her face, her uniform plastered to her skin. The door opened almost immediately, as if someone had been watching her approach. The man who answered wasn't what she expected. He was young, maybe 30, dressed in an expensive suit that fit too well to be anything but custom-tailored. His eyes were dark and assessing, the kind that measured threats before pleasantries. Behind him, the house stretched into shadows and marble, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. Mara held out the package, already backing away, already knowing she'd made a mistake. The man took it without speaking, turning it over in his hands with a frown that deepened into something dangerous. He looked at the label, then at her, then called over his shoulder in Italian, words she didn't understand but felt in her bones. More men appeared, materializing from doorways and shadows like smoke taking human form. They moved with military precision, surrounding her before she could process what was happening. Hands grabbed her arms, professional and rough, steering her inside despite her protests. The door closed behind them with the finality of a coffin lid. The underground. They took her down. That was the first real moment of terror, when she realized the stairs kept descending, spiraling beneath the house into spaces that shouldn't exist. The temperature dropped. The air grew thick with the smell of aged wine and something else, something older and darker that she couldn't name. The wine cellar was vast, stretching beyond what the overhead lights revealed. Bottles lined the walls in neat rows, labels in languages she didn't recognize, vintages that predated her birth. In the center of the space stood a man who commanded attention without moving, who seemed to bend the very air around him through presence alone. Don Alessandro Vitale was 42 years old, though the weight he carried made him seem ageless. His suit was black and impeccable, his hair silver at the temples, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied her with eyes that had seen too much to ever look entirely human. This was a man who'd built an empire on violence and silence, who'd buried enough bodies to populate a small town, who'd learned long ago that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. The men forced Mara to her knees on the cold stone floor. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, hair dripping into her eyes, hands trembling not just from cold, but from the sudden, crystalline understanding that she might not leave this place alive. She thought of her mother in the hospital bed, waiting for a daughter who would never arrive. Alessandro moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He held the package, turning it over with careful precision. Then he opened it, and Mara saw his expression change, saw something dangerous slide behind his eyes like a shark beneath dark water. Inside wasn't the documents or products she'd assumed. Inside was a small electronic device, professional grade, the kind that costs more than she'd make in 5 years. A listening device, a federal microphone. Someone had used her, transformed her into an unwitting courier for surveillance equipment meant to bring down the most powerful crime family in New York. The silence that followed stretched like wire pulled to breaking. Alessandro looked at the device, then at Mara, then at his men. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm that preceded violence, the eye of a storm that would destroy everything in its path. His men understood immediately. They grabbed her again, hauling her to her feet, dragging her toward a door at the far end of the cellar. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but terror had stolen her voice, wrapped fingers around her throat and squeezed until only gasps escaped. They emerged into rain again, but different rain, colder and harder. The vineyard stretched behind the estate, rows of dormant vines waiting for spring that would never come for her. The men carried shovels. Alessandro followed at a distance, hands still clasped behind his back, expression carved from marble. The confession. The hole they started digging was shallow and efficient, professional in its dimensions. Mara knelt in the mud, watching them work, mind racing through possibilities that all ended the same way. She thought about her mother, about the last conversation they'd had. Sharp words exchanged in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and regret. They'd been fighting for years, mother and daughter, wounds inflicted and received in equal measure. Her mother had been absent for most of Mara's childhood, chasing men and dreams across state lines, leaving her daughter with relatives who resented the burden. Then cancer had come, bringing her back broken and apologetic, expecting forgiveness that Mara had refused to give. The last words between them had been bitter. Accusations and defenses, old hurts reopened, the kind of conversation where both sides lose because pride matters more than peace. Mara had left the hospital room angry, promising herself she'd never apologize, never give her mother the satisfaction of reconciliation. Now, kneeling in mud with rain washing away her tears, Mara understood the mathematics of regret. She understood that time wasn't infinite, that chances expired, that death made permanent what pride kept temporary. The hole was almost deep enough. Alessandro's men climbed out, breathing hard, waiting for orders. That's when the words came, ripping from her throat before thought could stop them. Not a plea for mercy, not a denial of guilt she didn't have, but something more fundamental, more human. A confession of the one thing that mattered more than survival. She spoke about her mother, about the hospital bed and the beeping machines, about years of anger and the conversation she'd never have, about forgiveness she'd withheld out of spite, and how desperately she needed to give it now, before time ran out, before death made the decision permanent. The words poured from her like blood from a wound, raw and desperate and completely true. She wasn't performing. She wasn't manipulating. She was simply breaking open, letting out the pressure that had been building for years, choosing honesty in the moment before oblivion. Alessandro froze. The word isn't metaphorical. His entire body went rigid, hand raised to signal his men, face transforming from cold calculation to something unguarded and wounded. The rain continued falling, but the universe had shifted somehow, some fundamental equation altered by words that shouldn't have mattered, but did. The ghost of memory. Alessandro Vitale had been 17 when his mother died. Cancer, like Mara's mother, eating her from the inside while he watched helpless and angry. She'd lain in a hospital bed in Queens, the same hospital where Mara's mother struggled now, breathing through machines that prolonged dying rather than prevented it. They'd fought the last time he saw her. She'd wanted him to leave the family business, to take the money she'd saved and disappear to somewhere safe. He'd been young and stupid and certain of his immortality, convinced that power mattered more than safety, that respect came from fear rather than love. He'd said cruel things, words designed to wound because wounding felt like control. She died 3 days later while he was in Jersey handling business too important to delay. He'd gotten the call in a warehouse that smelled of blood and gasoline, his hands still dirty from work that couldn't be discussed in daylight. By the time he arrived at the hospital, she was already gone, already cold, the words between them frozen forever in anger. 25 years had passed since then. Alessandro had built an empire, accumulated wealth and power beyond anything his father could have imagined. He'd killed men who threatened him, destroyed families who challenged his authority, carved out territory through violence and strategic brilliance. But he'd never said goodbye to his mother. He'd never apologized. He'd never told her that he understood, that he wished he'd listened, that he'd give everything he'd built for 5 more minutes in that hospital room. The memory lived in him like a ghost, haunting the spaces between heartbeats, emerging in quiet moments when control slipped. He'd learned to carry it, to function despite it, to build walls high enough that nothing could reach the places where regret lived. Until now. Until this girl kneeling in mud, speaking words that bypassed every defense he'd constructed. Alessandro lowered his hand. His men looked confused, waiting for clarification, but he ignored them. He was staring at Mara, seeing not a threat or a liability, but a mirror reflecting his own past, his own failure, his own unfinished business with death and forgiveness. The rain kept falling. The hole remained empty. And something in Alessandro Vitale, something he thought had died 25 years ago, stirred like muscle memory from a life he'd abandoned. The impossible decision. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably seconds. Alessandro's men stood motionless, reading their boss's body language, understanding that something had shifted, but not knowing what or why. Mara remained on her knees, shaking from cold and adrenaline, unable to process what was happening. Then Alessandro spoke, his voice quieter than before, carrying authority that didn't need volume. He ordered his men to stop, to put away the shovels, to take her inside. The words fell like stones into water, creating ripples that would expand far beyond this moment. His lieutenants tried to argue. They spoke in rapid Italian about security and precedent, about the rules that kept them alive and the consequences of mercy in a world built on consequence. But Alessandro cut through their objections with a look that reminded everyone why he'd survived when others hadn't, why he led when others followed. When? They brought Mara back into the house, into warmth and light that felt shocking after the darkness of the vineyard. Someone gave her towels and dry clothes, led her to a bathroom where she could wash mud from her skin and try to understand what had just happened. She stared at herself in the mirror, searching for some sign that she'd died, and this was whatever came after. But the face looking back remained stubbornly alive. Alessandro waited in his study, a room lined with books he'd never read and art he'd never chosen, the kind of space designed to project culture onto violence. He stood by the window, watching rain-streaked glass, mind working through calculations that no longer made sense. Every instinct screamed at him to finish what he'd started. She'd seen too much, knew too much, represented too much risk. In his world, loose ends got people killed, and she was the loosest end imaginable. But he couldn't stop thinking about his mother, about hospital beds and unfinished conversations, about the mathematics of regret that accumulated interest over decades. When Mara finally emerged, cleaned but still shaking, Alessandro studied her with new eyes. She wasn't particularly remarkable. Not beautiful in any conventional sense, just a young woman drowning in circumstances beyond her control. But she'd said something true in a moment when lies would have been easier, and truth was the rarest currency in his world. The proposal Alessandro made a decision that made no tactical sense, that violated every principle he'd built his empire upon. He couldn't send her back to her life, not with what she knew, not with federal agents potentially watching her movements. But he couldn't kill her either, not after what had passed between them in the rain. So he offered her something impossible, a job. Not as a prisoner or a hostage, but as an employee. She would deliver packages for him, handle personal errands, move through his world with a freedom no outsider had ever possessed. In exchange, he would pay her mother's medical bills, ensure she got the best care available, buy the time Mara needed to have the conversation she'd almost died regretting. The offer hung between them like smoke. Mara tried to process it, to understand the calculus that led a crime boss to spare someone who should have been eliminated. Alessandro didn't explain. He wasn't in the habit of justifying decisions, and this one made sense only in ways he couldn't articulate. She accepted because what choice did she have? Because her mother was dying, and debt was drowning her, and sometimes survival meant accepting help from devils, but also because something in Alessandro's eyes suggested he understood her in ways other people didn't, that he carried ghosts similar to hers, that they were both trapped in different versions of the same regret. The next morning, Mara found herself standing in Mount Sinai Hospital with a check large enough to pay for a year of treatment. The nurses looked at her differently, the doctors suddenly available, the machinery and medications previously just out of reach now accessible. She sat beside her mother's bed, watching monitors beep, gathering courage for a conversation she should have had months ago. When her mother woke, Mara spoke words she'd been rehearsing since kneeling in mud with death breathing down her neck. She apologized for the anger and the distance, for withholding forgiveness like a weapon, for wasting time they didn't have on pride neither could afford. Her mother cried, and Mara cried, and between them something old and poisonous began to dissolve. The new normal weeks passed, then months. Mara became a fixture in Alessandro's world, moving through it like a ghost that everyone could see, but nobody quite understood. She delivered packages to places she'd never known existed, moved money and messages through channels that operated outside law and consequence. The other men in the organization watched her warily, uncertain how to categorize someone who should have been dead but walked free. Alessandro kept his distance, interacting with her only when necessary, maintaining the professional boundary that made their arrangement possible. But sometimes she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, something between curiosity and recognition, as if he were seeing not just her, but all the versions of himself he might have been if circumstances had shifted slightly. She learned the rhythms of his world, the unspoken rules that govern survival. Never ask questions, never mention what you see. Trust nobody completely, but appear trustworthy to everyone. It was a delicate dance, and she was learning the steps, transforming from terrified delivery driver into something stranger and more complicated. Her mother's condition stabilized, then improved. The specialist care worked miracles that prayer alone couldn't manage, pulling her back from the edge Mara had thought was inevitable. They had conversations now, real ones, excavating years of hurt and misunderstanding with the careful precision of archaeologists working fragile ground. Mara told her mother nothing about Alessandro or the circumstances that made this care possible. Some truths were too dangerous to share, some debts too complicated to explain. Her mother accepted the miracle without questioning its source, and Mara let her, protecting her from knowledge that would only bring danger closer. The federal problem. But miracles attracted attention, and attention brought scrutiny. The federal agents who'd planted the listening device in that original package hadn't forgotten about Mara Lewis. They'd lost their microphone and their surveillance target, but they'd gained something potentially more valuable, a connection between their investigation and someone who'd walked into Alessandro Vitale's inner circle and emerged alive. They approached her carefully, professionally, two agents in unremarkable suits waiting by her car after a delivery. They didn't threaten, they didn't accuse. They simply offered her a choice, framed as inevitability. Cooperate or watch everyone she cared about get dragged into an investigation that would destroy lives without solving crimes. Mara listened to their pitch with the careful neutrality Alessandro had taught her, showing nothing while calculating everything. They wanted her to wear a wire, to document conversations, to gather evidence that could bring down the Vitale family after decades of untouchable operation. They made it sound simple, safe, like she could play both sides without consequence. She thanked them politely and drove away, mind racing through possibilities that all ended badly. If she cooperated, Alessandro would know, would feel the betrayal like a knife between ribs, and whatever mercy he'd shown would evaporate. If she refused, the agents would make her life impossible, would find ways to pressure her until she broke or died trying not to. That night, Mara made a decision that surprised even her. She went to Alessandro directly, told him about the federal approach without embellishment or excuse. She laid out exactly what they'd offered, what they'd threatened, and waited for his response with the calm of someone who'd already accepted whatever came next. Alessandro listened without interrupting, face unreadable, mind working through implications and responses. When she finished, he asked her a single question. Did she want to help them? Not would she, but did she want to? The distinction mattered. Mara thought about her mother in the hospital bed, about the money that kept flowing for treatments she could never have afforded. She thought about Alessandro stopping his men in the rain, about the ghost that lived behind his eyes, about the strange respect that had grown between them. She thought about debts and loyalty and the complicated mathematics of surviving in worlds that didn't forgive mistakes. No, she told him, she didn't want to help them. Whatever she'd become since that rainy night, it wasn't someone who betrayed the person who'd given her back time with her mother. The trap Alessandro had survived decades in a business where trust killed as often as betrayal, because he understood one fundamental truth. The federal government never stopped hunting, but they were predictable in their persistence. The agents who'd approached Mara would return, would escalate pressure, would eventually create a situation where she had no choice but to cooperate or face consequences designed to break her. So he built a trap, elegant in its simplicity, using Mara as bait, not because he didn't trust her, but because the feds wouldn't believe she hadn't been turned. He fed her information carefully crafted to sound valuable, but lead nowhere. Meeting times that would be empty. Conversations about shipments that didn't exist. A careful construction of intelligence designed to waste federal resources while identifying every agent working the case. Mara delivered the false information beautifully, playing her role with the nervous authenticity of someone genuinely torn. The agents ate it up, believing they'd finally found their way inside, not realizing they were mapping themselves for Alessandro's benefit. Every question they asked revealed their investigation's scope. Every direction they pursued showed their blind spots. The operation culminated 3 months later in a federal raid on a warehouse Alessandro supposedly used for money laundering. 50 agents descended on the location with overwhelming force, battering through doors and shouting commands, only to find a legitimate import business operating exactly according to code. The paperwork was perfect. The products were legal. The employees were confused and cooperative. The humiliation was spectacular and public. News cameras caught federal agents retreating empty-handed, while lawyers threatened lawsuits. The investigation lost credibility and funding. Within 6 months, it was quietly closed, the task force reassigned to cases that might actually produce results. Mara watched it unfold with mixed feelings. She'd helped Alessandro avoid justice. Though what that word meant in this context remained unclear. He'd built an empire on violence and corruption, but he'd also saved her mother's life when nobody else could or would. The moral mathematics refused to resolve cleanly, leaving her suspended between gratitude and guilt. The transformation. A year passed, then two. Mara's role evolved from simple courier to something resembling a personal assistant, handling affairs too sensitive for Alessandro's regular staff, but too mundane for his lieutenants. She paid his legitimate bills, managed properties under false names, served as a buffer between his legal business and everything underneath. Her mother entered remission, the cancer retreating to wherever darkness hides when light finally breaks through. They had dinner together twice a week now, conversations flowing easily across territory that had once been mined with old resentments. Her mother asked sometimes about Mara's work, sensing something unsaid beneath surface explanations, but she never pushed, understanding that some knowledge was burden rather than blessing. Alessandro and Mara maintained their professional distance, but something had shifted between them, some recognition that they'd saved each other in different ways that night in the rain. He'd given her time with her mother. She'd given him something more complicated, evidence that mercy could survive in a world built to kill it, that the ghosts we carry might occasionally guide us toward redemption rather than haunting. They spoke rarely, but when they did, the conversations carried weight that had nothing to do with business. Alessandro asked about her mother's health, listened to updates with genuine interest that surprised his men. Mara noticed the pictures that appeared in his study, old photographs of a woman who must have been his mother, no longer hidden but displayed like evidence that the past could be honored without being changed. The city whispered about her, the girl who'd walked into the devil's house and emerged transformed rather than destroyed. Other crime families watched Alessandro's operation for signs of weakness, assuming that mercy meant vulnerability, that the boss had gone soft. They were wrong. Alessandro remained as dangerous as ever, perhaps more so because now he fought not just for power, but for the possibility that he'd made the right choice in that rainy vineyard. The reckoning. The peace couldn't last forever. In Alessandro's world, stability was temporary, a brief pause between conflicts that defined existence. The challenge came from within, from a lieutenant named Marco, who'd been with the family for 20 years and believed he understood how power worked. Marco saw Mara as evidence of weakness, a crack in the foundation that could be exploited. He began speaking to other men, asking careful questions about loyalty and leadership, suggesting that a boss who couldn't kill a delivery driver might not be strong enough to protect them when real threats emerged. The whispers grew louder, more dangerous, the kind of internal dissent that preceded coups. Alessandro knew about Marco's plotting almost immediately. His network of informants was vast and thorough, built through decades of careful cultivation. He could have ended the threat quietly, a conversation in a dark room that nobody discussed afterward, the kind of solution that maintained order through fear. But something had changed in him since that night in the rain. He was tired of solutions that required violence, tired of maintaining power through the constant threat of death. So he made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He called a meeting of his entire organization, every soldier and lieutenant, gathering them in the warehouse where he'd started building his empire 40 years ago. Marco attended with confidence that masked nervousness, uncertain what was happening, but convinced he could navigate whatever came. The other men filled the space with cautious energy, sensing something significant but unable to predict its direction. Mara stood at the back, an observer rather than participant, watching the man who'd saved her life do something nobody expected. Alessandro spoke about his mother, about hospital beds and unfinished conversations and regrets that accumulated like debt over decades. He spoke about the night Mara had walked into his life carrying a federal microphone and walked out carrying his mercy. He explained for the first time publicly why he'd made the choice that had confused and angered so many of his men. The room fell silent as he spoke, the kind of quiet that comes when people hear truth they didn't know they needed. Alessandro laid himself bare in front of men trained to exploit weakness, showing them the ghost he carried, the wound that had never healed, the moment he'd tried to reclaim by sparing someone who reminded him of opportunities lost. Then he addressed Marco directly, not with threats, but with a question. What kind of organization did they want to build? One where power came only through violence and mercy was eliminated as weakness? Or one where strength meant making hard choices that honored the humanity they'd all tried to bury? Marco had no answer. The question itself dismantled his argument, reframed the debate in ways he couldn't counter. The other men looked at each other, at Alessandro, at Mara standing at the back, and slowly the equation shifted. Loyalty wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about following someone who'd survived long enough to learn that survival wasn't the only thing worth fighting for. The final test. The meeting ended without violence, which itself felt revolutionary. Marco didn't apologize, but he stopped plotting, recognizing that Alessandro's strength wasn't diminished by mercy, but transformed by it. The organization continued operating, money continued flowing, but something fundamental had shifted in how power functioned. 2 weeks later, the final test arrived. The delivery driver who'd originally planted the microphone in Mara's package was found dead in Queens, executed professionally, a message sent by someone trying to restart the federal investigation. Evidence pointed carefully toward Alessandro's organization, the kind of frame job designed to force a response that would justify new scrutiny. Mara heard about it first, monitoring news reports as part of her duties. She brought the information to Alessandro immediately, understanding the implications, recognizing the trap being set. This was meant to restart the cycle of violence and investigation, to prove that his organization couldn't escape what it was. Alessandro studied the evidence with the careful attention he'd given everything since that night in the rain. He saw the frame job immediately, recognized the handiwork of a rival family trying to force his hand. The old Alessandro would have responded with overwhelming force, would have eliminated the threat and everyone connected to it, accepting the federal investigation as the cost of maintaining respect. But the old Alessandro had died somewhere in that rainy vineyard, replaced by someone who understood that some cycles needed breaking, even when breaking them felt like suicide. He made a decision that shocked even Mara. He would do nothing, no retaliation, no violence, just evidence carefully preserved and delivered to federal investigators showing exactly who'd committed the murder and why. His lieutenants argued against it, insisted that showing weakness invited destruction, that other families would interpret restraint as surrender. Alessandro listened to their objections, then explained something they'd forgotten in decades of violence. Power didn't just come from what you could destroy. It came from what you could choose not to destroy, from showing strength in unexpected ways that redefined the game. The evidence reached the FBI through anonymous channels. Within a week, arrests were made in a rival family, their operations disrupted by internal investigations. The federal agents, grateful for cooperation they hadn't expected, quietly shelved their interest in Alessandro's organization. And throughout the criminal underworld, a new reputation began forming around the man who'd spared a delivery driver and then refused to play the game that was supposed to destroy him. 3 years later, Mara sat in a hospital room, but this time the patient was different. Alessandro Vitale lay in the bed, machines beeping steadily, monitoring a heart that had finally begun to fail. Not from violence, not from the dangers that had haunted him for decades, but from the simple mathematics of age and stress accumulated over a lifetime. His organization had survived his transformation, adapted to a model where power came from strategic intelligence rather than just violence. Mara had risen within it, not as muscle, but as the person who managed the legitimate operations that now funded most of their work. The money laundering continued, the corruption persisted, but the body count had dropped, and something resembling honor had crept into spaces previously occupied only by fear. Alessandro's mother's pictures hung on the wall of his hospital room, placed there by Mara when he'd first been admitted. He'd thanked her with his eyes, too weak to speak, but still capable of recognizing gestures that honored his ghost. They'd become family in the strange way that transcended blood, connected by a moment in the rain when mercy had prevailed over every instinct that argued against it. Mara's mother visited daily, bringing food and conversation, having finally learned the truth about how her daughter's world had transformed. She'd been horrified at first, then gradually understanding, recognizing that morality in practice was more complicated than morality in theory. She sat now across from Mara, watching Alessandro sleep, bearing witness to the strange mercy that had saved them both. The doctors said Alessandro had weeks, maybe days. His lieutenants had already begun positioning themselves for succession, playing the games that powerful men always played when thrones emptied. But Mara didn't care about that, didn't care about the empire or what would happen to it. She cared about the man in the bed, about the ghost he'd carried for 25 years before finally finding a way to honor it. When Alessandro woke, Mara leaned close and spoke words she'd been preparing for this moment. She told him about her mother's latest remission, about the grandchild she was expecting, about the life that wouldn't have existed without his mercy. She thanked him not just for saving her life, but for showing her that redemption was possible, even in spaces designed to prevent it. Alessandro smiled, the expression weary but genuine. He'd made many choices in his 70 years, most of them calculated to acquire and maintain power. But the choice he'd made in the rain that November night, the decision to spare a girl who'd reminded him of unfinished business with his own ghost, that was the one he'd never regretted, the one that had transformed everything after. He died 3 days later, peacefully, his mother's pictures surrounding him and Mara holding his hand. The funeral was massive, filled with criminals and politicians and people whose lives had been touched by both his violence and his unexpected mercy. The city mourned him in complicated ways, unable to reconcile the man who'd built an empire on blood with the one who'd learned, finally, to choose something else. Epilogue. Mara stood at Alessandro's grave 6 months after his death, her daughter sleeping in a carrier on her chest. The organization had fractured after his passing, different lieutenants taking pieces of the empire and building their own operations. She'd walked away from all of it, using money Alessandro had left her to open a legitimate logistics company that employed former criminals trying to build different lives. Her mother stood beside her, older now but healthy, the cancer beaten back by treatments that mercy had made possible. They'd learned to talk about what had happened, about the complicated morality of accepting help from devils, about how grace sometimes arrived through unexpected channels. The city had moved on. New crime families rose to fill the vacuum Alessandro left, playing the same games with the same rules, most of them never learning what he'd discovered too late in life. That power could be more than violence, that mercy could be strategic rather than weak, that the ghosts we carried could guide us toward redemption if we listened carefully enough. As Mara turned to leave, she noticed a young woman standing near another grave, crying quietly, the kind of grief that suggested recent loss and unfinished business. Mara recognized the expression, the body language of someone trapped by regret they couldn't undo. She almost walked past, almost minded her own business, the way survivors learn to do. But Alessandro's ghost was real for her too now, living in the spaces between heartbeats, reminding her that mercy multiplied when shared. She approached the young woman carefully, offered a tissue, asked gently if she wanted to talk. The woman looked up, surprised, then began speaking about her father, about words unsaid and time expired, about the permanent silence that death imposed. Mara listened, really listened, the way Alessandro had listened to her in the rain. And when the woman finished, Mara told her a story about a delivery driver and a crime boss, about a night when everything should have ended but didn't, about the strange salvation that arrived when someone chose to see humanity in a moment designed for elimination. The woman listened with the careful attention of someone drowning being thrown a rope. When Mara finished, she asked a question. How did you forgive yourself for the things you couldn't fix? How did you survive the weight of regret? Mara looked down at her daughter, thought about her mother waiting in the car, about Alessandro in his grave, and his mother's pictures on his hospital wall. She spoke the truth she'd learned through all of it. You didn't forgive yourself, not completely, but you honored the ghosts by living differently, by choosing mercy when vengeance felt easier, by giving other people the chances you wished you'd taken. The sun was setting over New York, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and shadow. Mara said goodbye to the young woman and walked toward her car, toward her mother and daughter, and the life that shouldn't have existed, but somehow did. Behind her, Alessandro's grave stood among thousands of others, marking the resting place of a man who'd discovered, almost too late, that the hardest power to wield was the power to choose kindness over consequence. The city kept moving, kept breathing, kept generating stories of violence and redemption that nobody would fully understand. But somewhere in the equations of survival and power, mercy had carved out space that hadn't existed before. And that space, small as it was, mattered more than empires. If you've been moved by this story of unexpected redemption and second chances, subscribe to our channel for more narratives that explore the complicated spaces between darkness and light, where mercy and consequence wrestle for supremacy, and sometimes, just sometimes, grace prevails.